In the spring of 1942, in a small office at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, a 37-year-old lieutenant commander in the United States Navy sat at a desk covered in hand-drawn diagrams and spent several nights working through a problem in geometry that, by the time he finished with it, would change the outcome of the air war over the Pacific. The lieutenant commander's name was John Smith Thach. He had grown up in Fordyce, Arkansas, the son of a railroad man. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1927 with a reputation among his classmates for being unusually methodical and unusually calm. He was not famous then. He was not famous for most of the war. The problem he was working on was whether two American fighter aircraft, properly coordinated, could survive an engagement with a Japanese Zero when a single American fighter almost certainly could not. To understand why that problem mattered, you need to understand what the Zero was. The Mitsubishi A-6M, designated by American intelligence as the Zero, had entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1940 and had spent the following 2 years accumulating a combat record that had no parallel among carrier-based fighters anywhere in the world. Over China and then over the Pacific, it had demonstrated a rate of climb, a turning radius, a low-speed maneuverability that American, British, and Dutch fighter pilots had not encountered and had not prepared for. When Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the Zeros assigned as escorts destroyed 40 American aircraft in the air and on the ground at a cost of 9 of their own. In the Philippines, over Malaya. In the Dutch East Indies over the following weeks. The Zero's performance repeated itself with a consistency that the Allied air commands found difficult to explain and more difficult to answer. The American fighter that Thach was flying and training others to fly in early 1942 was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. It was a stocky, compact monoplane with a maximum speed of roughly 318 miles per hour and a rate of climb of about 1,950 feet per minute. The Zero could reach 331 miles per hour and climb at 3,100 feet per minute. Below 200 miles per hour, the Zero could outturn the Wildcat so decisively that an American pilot who allowed an engagement to slow to that speed was in a condition that training manuals had not yet found adequate language to describe. Navy fighter pilots who had survived the early weeks of the war came back with accounts of watching their squadron mates attempt to maneuver against the Zero and fail in ways that seemed to leave no corrective option. The standard doctrine of the time that called for individual fighter pilots to use speed and altitude to control an engagement did not translate against an aircraft that could negate both advantages within the first 60 seconds of a turning fight. Thach had been told by a fellow pilot named Butch O'Hare in late 1941 that Japanese fighter pilots who had been flying against the Chinese Air Force had developed a technique of following a target aircraft through any maneuver the target could make. A pursuit so relentless and so geometrically precise that breaking away from it had proven, in combat after combat, to be effectively impossible. Thach took this information seriously in a way that some of his contemporaries did not. He believed, on the basis of the performance specifications he had seen for the Zero, that O'Hare's account was accurate and that the standard American response of relying on speed and individual aggression would continue to produce the same results it had been producing since December. What he needed was a maneuver that did not require the Wildcat to outturn or outclimb the Zero. This was because the Wildcat could do neither. What he needed was a maneuver that turned the Zero's superior agility into a liability rather than an asset. The solution Thach developed, working initially with matchbooks on his desk to represent aircraft, was a coordinated two-plane maneuver that operated on a principle the Zero's designers had not anticipated and that Japanese pilots had not been trained to counter. Two Wildcats flew in a loose formation, separated by a distance of roughly 200 yards. when a Zero began an attack run on one of them. That pilot turned toward his wingman rather than away from the threat. The wingman simultaneously turned toward the first pilot. The two aircraft crossed paths head-on. That positioned the second Wildcat on a direct gun deflection shot at the pursuing Zero. The Zero, committed to its attack run, found itself in the gun sight of an aircraft it had not been tracking, approaching from a direction that its own forward momentum made impossible to escape within the available turning radius. The maneuver was geometrically simple. Its implications were not. Thach began testing the maneuver with his squadron, VF-3, in early 1942 at North Island. He set up practice engagements in which a small number of Wildcats flying his new formation were attacked by a larger number of aircraft flown by pilots instructed to use the most aggressive tactics available to them, according to Thach's own after-action accounts that are preserved in the archives of the Naval Historical Center in Washington. The results of those exercises were consistent enough that he had confidence in the maneuver before he had ever tested it in combat. He submitted a formal report to the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics describing the formation and requesting that it be evaluated for wider adoption. The Bureau of Aeronautics acknowledged the submission. It did not immediately act on it. The first combat test of what would eventually be called the Thach Weave came on the 4th of June 1942 during the Battle of Midway. That remains the most consequential carrier engagement in the history of naval aviation. Thach was leading a six-plane escort for a torpedo bomber squadron designated VT-3, flying devastators on a strike against the Japanese carrier force. Before the torpedo bombers reached their targets, they were intercepted by a large number of Zeros from the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. The Wildcats were immediately outnumbered by a margin that Thach later estimated at between 6 and 8 to 1. 3 of his 6 fighters were shot down in the opening minutes of the engagement. Thach, with the 3 remaining aircraft, executed the weave continuously for nearly 12 minutes against a force that should, by any conventional calculation of the engagement, have destroyed all 6 aircraft before any of them reached the fleet. Thach shot down 3 Zeros himself during those 12 minutes. His remaining 2 wingmen accounted for at least 2 more. More significantly, none of the 3 surviving Wildcats was destroyed. All 3 eventually broke off the engagement and returned to their carrier. Thach's after-action report, submitted to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the Yorktown later that afternoon, described the maneuver in operational detail and stated flatly that it worked, that it had worked against numerically superior opposition and against pilots who were by any observable standard among the best fighter pilots in the Japanese Naval Air Service. Fletcher forwarded the report up the chain of command. This time, the Navy read it with considerably more attention than the Bureau of Aeronautics had paid to the earlier submission. What made the Thach Weave effective in a way that went beyond the geometry of any single engagement was that it imposed a fundamental change on the terms of the air-to-air contest over the Pacific. The Zero's entire tactical doctrine rested on the premise that individual superior performance would consistently determine outcomes. Japanese naval aviators had been selected through a training pipeline of extraordinary severity. A pipeline that by 1941 had produced a relatively small corps of pilots of genuinely exceptional skill. The carrier strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor carried airmen who had averaged between 500 and 800 flying hours before their first combat assignment, at a time when the average American carrier pilot was entering operational service with roughly 300 hours. The Zero's designers had given those pilots an aircraft that rewarded individual mastery of low-speed maneuvering. The combination of machine and pilot had produced, in the 18 months between the Zero's first combat deployment and the Battle of Midway, a record of aerial dominance that no other naval air force had matched in the same period. The Thach Weave attacked that doctrine at its premise. It required that a Japanese pilot pursuing one Wildcat simultaneously maintain awareness of a second Wildcat that was turning toward him from a crossing angle, arriving in his gun sight at a relative speed and from a direction that his forward pursuit had made geometrically difficult to evade. The maneuver did not require American pilots to outfly their opponents. It required them to outthink them as a team. It punished the individual aggression that the Zero's superiority had been reinforcing in Japanese tactics since 1940. Every time a Japanese pilot committed to a pursuit with the confidence his aircraft's performance had previously earned him, the Weave converted that confidence into exposure. The Zero's agility, which had been a decisive asset in every individual turning fight, became a mechanism for delivering its pilot into a gun solution he had not seen developing. The Navy formally incorporated the Thach Weave into its fighter tactics manual in the months following Midway and began teaching it across all fleet fighter training programs. Thach himself was ordered stateside in the summer of 1942, partly to recover from the cumulative stress of the Midway engagement, and partly because the Navy had concluded that what he knew about fighting Zeros was more valuable in a classroom than in a cockpit. He spent a period at the Naval Air Training Command developing instructional materials and working directly with the new pilots who were moving through the expanded wartime training pipeline. By the end of 1942, the Weave was a standard doctrine aboard every American carrier in the Pacific Fleet. By early 1943, it was being executed routinely by pilots who had never seen Japan and had no memory of the first terrible months of the war. The timing of the Thach Weave's adoption coincided with several other developments that collectively shifted the balance of the air war over the Pacific in a direction from which Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, that entered combat service in August 1943, was a larger and more powerful aircraft than the Wildcat that Thach had been flying, capable of 376 miles per hour and a climb rate that reduced the Zero's performance advantage to a narrow margin rather than a decisive one. But the Hellcat entered service with pilots who had been trained on the Thach Weave. The tactics that had made the inferior Wildcat survivable made the superior Hellcat lethal in a way that exceeded the raw performance differential between the two aircraft. In the Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944, American fighters flying Hellcats destroyed 346 Japanese aircraft in 2 days of combat at a loss of 29 of their own, a kill ratio of nearly 12-to-1 that would have been arithmetically impossible without the coordinated pair tactics that Thach had worked out on his desk at North Island 2 years earlier, with nothing more than a pencil and a set of matchbooks. By the middle of 1944, the core of the Japanese Naval Air Corps that had flown the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had swept across China and the Pacific in the Zero's years of dominance, was effectively gone. The training pipeline that had produced pilots with 600 and 700 flying hours before their first combat deployment had been consuming replacements faster than it could make them since Midway. The replacements who reached the fleet carried 100 hours of training against opponents who had been trained on every lesson of 2 years of Pacific air combat, including the lesson that John Thach had put on paper before most of those opponents had ever left the ground.